It was an old hotel in the heart of New Orleans, a place steeped in history and legend. I had always been drawn to the city's rich culture and its reputation for the paranormal. That's why, when I heard about the Hotel Montalina and its room 333, I knew I had to experience it for myself. As I entered the lobby, the hotel's faded grandeur was immediately apparent. The chandeliers hung low, their crystals covered in a layer of dust. The front desk clerk greeted me with a knowing smile, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Welcome to Hotel Montalina. Are you here for room 333? I nodded, trying to hide my excitement. "Yes, I've heard the stories." The clerk handed me an ornate key with an oversized brass 333 attached to it. "Enjoy your stay," he said, his voice tinged with an eerie cheerfulness. The elevator ride to the third floor was unnerving, the soft hum of the outdated machinery filling the small space. When I reached the corridor, it was like stepping back in time. The wallpaper was faded, and the carpet was worn, but it added to the charm of the place. Room 333 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. As I entered, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, causing the curtains to flutter. The air was heavy with a musty scent, and the atmosphere was oppressive, as if I had stepped into another dimension. I couldn't help but shiver as I explored the room. The antique furniture, the faded paintings on the walls, and the dim lighting all added to the eerie ambience. The room had a small balcony, and as I stepped outside, I could hear the distant sounds of the city, the lively music and laughter of the French Quarter. As night fell, I settled into bed, determined to experience whatever mysteries room 333 held. The room was bathed in moonlight, and I could hear the faint rustling of curtains and the distant sounds of footsteps in the hallway. But it was the mirror that caught my attention, a full-length mirror on the opposite wall. As I gazed at my reflection, I noticed something strange. My reflection seemed to move independently of me, its movements slow and deliberate, like a silent observer. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror as my reflection began to change, its features shifting and distorting. It took on the appearance of a woman in a tattered white gown, her hair hanging loose around her face. Her eyes were hollow, filled with a sadness that sent a chill down my spine. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I tried to speak, to ask who she was and what she wanted, but my voice failed me. The room grew colder, and I could feel a presence behind me, a ghostly hand on my shoulder. And then, with a sudden, violent force, the room seemed to come alive. The curtains billowed, the furniture shook, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. I screamed, my heart pounding, and the room fell silent. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew I had experienced something beyond the realm of the ordinary. I spent the rest of the night in a state of unease, unable to sleep, my senses on high alert. The next morning, I left room 333 behind, my heart heavy with the memory of the haunting. The front desk clerk gave me a knowing look as I checked out, his smile more enigmatic than ever. As I left the Hotel Montalina, I couldn't help but wonder about the woman in the mirror, the restless spirit who had reached out to me from the other side. What had happened to her? And why was she trapped in that unsettling room? The mysteries of room 333 would stay with me forever, a chilling reminder that some places held secrets that were best left undisturbed. The forest was dense and ancient, a place where time seemed to stand still. The Whispering Woods, as it was known, had earned its name for the eerie murmurs and soft voices that could be heard among the trees. It was said that the woods were cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had become lost within its depths. I had always been drawn to the supernatural, and the legends of the Whispering Woods had piqued my curiosity. Armed with a map and a sense of adventure, I ventured into the heart of the forest, determined to uncover its secrets. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting long, twisted shadows on the forest floor. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and a sense of foreboding settled over me as I ventured deeper into the woods. As I walked, I could hear the soft murmurs and whispers that had given the forest its name. They were like distant conversations, their words unintelligible but haunting in their cadence. It was as if the very trees themselves were speaking to me, their voices filled with secrets and sorrow. The deeper I went, the more the whispers seemed to grow louder, their voices more insistent. It was as if the woods were trying to communicate with me, to draw me further into its embrace. And then, as I reached a small clearing, I saw her, a woman in a tattered white gown, her dark hair hanging loose around her face. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes hollow and filled with despair. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying a sense of urgency. I couldn't resist her plea. I approached her, my heart pounding, and reached out a hand to touch her. As our fingers made contact, a blinding light enveloped us, and the forest seemed to come alive with a malevolent force. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The whispers grew louder, their words filled with anger and sorrow. I could feel the woman's presence beside me, her anguish overwhelming. And then, with a sudden, violent force, the forest seemed to close in around us, a wall of darkness that swallowed us whole. Hours, perhaps even days, passed in that nightmarish realm. I lost all sense of time, my mind consumed by the whispers that filled my ears. I saw other trapped souls, their faces twisted with pain and sorrow, and I knew I was not alone. But through the madness, I clung to a single thought, the need to escape, to break free from the cursed woods. And then, one day, it happened. The forest grew still, the whispers silenced, and I found myself back on the forest floor, alone. I stumbled to my feet, weak and disoriented, and made my way out of the Whispering Woods. The once dense forest seemed to have lost its malevolence, as if the darkness that had trapped me had been lifted. As I left the forest behind, I couldn't help but wonder about the woman in the tattered white gown, the spirit who had reached out to me from the other side. What had happened to her? And why was she trapped in the Whispering Woods? The mysteries of the cursed forest would stay with me forever, a chilling reminder that some places held secrets that were best left undisturbed. Ravenswood Manor was a grand, old mansion that had been abandoned for decades. It stood on a hill overlooking the small town, its decaying facade a stark contrast to the lush, overgrown gardens that surrounded it. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, tales of unexplained phenomena and ghostly apparitions that had driven most away. But I had always been drawn to the supernatural, and the legends of Ravenswood Manor had captivated my imagination. I decided to spend the night there, determined to uncover the truth behind the haunting. As I entered the mansion, a sense of unease settled over me. The air was heavy with the scent of dampness and decay, and the grand foyer was shrouded in darkness. Cobwebs hung from the chandeliers, and dust-covered furniture lay draped in white sheets. I ascended the grand staircase, each step groaning beneath my weight. The second floor was no less eerie, with dimly lit corridors and peeling wallpaper. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, their voices barely audible, like the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I made my way to a room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. The room was bathed in an otherworldly light, and the scent of roses hung in the air, sweet and cloying. In the center of the room, I saw her, a woman in a flowing white gown, her dark hair cascading down her back. She stood by the window, her eyes vacant and mournful. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. She turned to me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I am Isabella," she whispered. "I've been waiting for you." Her voice sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. She beckoned me closer, her hand outstretched. I took a hesitant step toward her, drawn by an inexplicable force. As I approached, her image seemed to waver, like a mirage. I reached out to touch her, but my hand passed through her form, and I stumbled forward, crashing into the window. The glass shattered, and the room was filled with the sound of breaking glass and my own panicked gasps. I pulled myself to my feet, bleeding from a gash on my arm, and looked around. The room was now empty, the scent of roses fading into the stale air. Isabella had vanished, leaving only shattered glass and a sense of foreboding in her wake. I knew I should leave, that I had seen enough, but an inexplicable curiosity urged me to stay. The night had fallen outside, and the mansion seemed to come alive with eerie sounds, a distant whisper, a soft, mournful sigh. I descended deeper into the manor, the corridors growing darker with each step. The walls closed in around me, and I felt as if I were being watched. I entered a room, and there, in the flickering candlelight, I saw a circle of people dressed in antiquated clothing, their faces obscured by masks. They were engaged in a bizarre, ritualistic dance, their movements graceful yet unsettling. As they moved, they chanted in a language I couldn't understand, their voices rising and falling in an eerie cadence. I watched in horror as the dance grew more frenzied, the room filled with a palpable sense of malevolence. And then, with a sudden, violent force, they stopped, their masks turning to face me. A wave of terror washed over me as I realized that the masks were not mere disguises, but grotesque, monstrous faces, twisted and contorted. I turned and ran, the haunting chant of the masked figures echoing in my ears. I stumbled through the darkened corridors, my flashlight flickering, and finally burst through a door that led to the basement. The air grew colder as I descended into the depths, and I could feel a malevolent presence closing in on me. In the basement, I found myself in a chamber that seemed to be the epicenter of the malevolence that had enveloped Ravenswood Manor. The walls were adorned with grotesque symbols, and in the center of the room, a portal seemed to swirl with dark energy. And then I saw her again, Isabella, her form ethereal and translucent. She stood at the edge of the portal, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You were drawn here, just like me," she whispered. "They used the mansion to tether our souls to this place." I tried to speak, to ask her more, but the malevolent presence in the room grew stronger, like a storm gathering momentum. Isabella's form wavered, and I knew I had to act quickly. I reached out to her, and as our hands touched, a blinding light enveloped us. The room shook with an otherworldly force, and I could hear the voices of the masked figures chanting, their words distorted and anguished. And then, with a final surge of energy, the portal collapsed in on itself, pulling the malevolent presence with it. Isabella's form solidified, and she smiled, her eyes no longer haunted. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. As I left Ravenswood Manor, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had been drawn into its dark depths, how many souls were still trapped within its haunted halls. But one thing was certain, I had faced the horrors of the mansion, and I had emerged with a chilling tale of darkness and redemption.